Back in February 2020, I acquired 2 female leopard geckos and announced that with them I would be breaking some typical reptile husbandry rules. The first topic I addressed was about calci-sand causing impaction, but it seems to be that the second husbandry myth that I've been wanting to talk about has proven to be even more contentious, and this myth is that cohabitation is necessarily a bad thing for leopard geckos. Right from when I got the female leopard geckos, Dottie and Pepper, I told you that I was ultimately going to keep them in the same enclosure as my male leopard gecko, Speckles, and since saying this, I have had a huge number of people coming to tell me why this is such a bad idea. So in today's video, I'm going to be giving you the rationale behind why I have decided to keep my leopard geckos together, and I'm even going to make the case that perhaps cohabitation should be seen as something which is part of the basic care requirements of certain species of reptile. Or at the very least, something that, if we were to address it properly, would offer a lot of scope for improving the captive environments within which we keep our reptiles. And as well as this, I am of course going to be showing you how I introduced my leopard geckos to each other and how that it has gone since then. So let's get straight into it. So first up, let's discuss the orthodox opinion about leopard gecko cohabitation so that you know where this video is coming from. So the typical wisdom suggests that there are 3 cohabiting situations for leopard geckos, being male leopard geckos kept with other males, a single male leopard gecko kept with multiple females, and females kept with other females. The first situation of males with other males is written off because males are highly territorial, and so putting them together in the confines of a vivarium is basically just asking for disaster. A mixed sex group isn't such a bad situation if you're a male leopard gecko, but if you are a female, you are going to have to put up with the constant breeding demands of the male, leaving the female leopard gecko permanently stressed, and of course ultimately physically depleted because of the toils of egg laying, and so this isn't really an ideal situation either. The third and final cohabiting scenario of females just being kept with other females can work, but seeing as there is a risk of them fighting and cohabitation doesn't really offer anything to the geckos themselves, it's not really something that you should do. I mean, what is the point of doing something that only benefits the keeper in getting to see them together? Or is even just an excuse to have more animals without having to shell out for another enclosure. And that is precisely where all of these arguments have their downfalls. In each case, there is an underlying assumption that cohabitation offers nothing beneficial to the reptiles themselves, and if this were the case, then I would agree that cohabitation is not something that we should be aiming to do. But seeing as I do cohab my leopard geckos, you might be able to figure out that I believe that there are very real benefits that living in a group setting offers to leopard geckos, and that's what we're going to talk about now. The first point to make is that wild leopard geckos are not the solitary animals that everybody seems to think that they are. In this paper by Mohammed Sharif Khan, which is one of the very few direct sources of information about wild leopard geckos that we have access to, Khan writes that leopard geckos are gregarious, and goes on to say that several lizards live in loose colonies in holes in the ground, under stones, and in crevices among rocks. A leopard gecko may climb several feet to reach its permanent selected resting place, which it shares with several individuals of different ages. In describing the social life of the leopard gecko, he writes that the composition of a eublepharine colony differs throughout the activity period of the gecko. A pre-breeding colony consists mostly of several sub-adults and adults. Soon fights between males ensue to scatter them, leaving a dominant male with several females constituting a breeding colony, whilst a post-breeding colony is dominated by juveniles. I think that this alone goes an enormous way to repainting the stereotyped figure of the solitary leopard gecko which never makes contact with conspecifics except to breed or to fight. Rather, this is an animal for which social interaction is a positive part of its daily life. That this is true is reflected in the fact that leopard geckos have such a complex behavioural repertoire, which includes tail waving, tail vibrating, gentle licking, mouthing, various whistling and squeaking sounds, and even the subtle fact that they will defecate in a shared latrine. If these were animals which really did spend their entire lives alone, why would they have such intricate means of communicating with each other? You might want to point out that truly solitary species still have ways of communicating with each other for breeding and territorial purposes, but I would argue that not all of leopard gecko social behaviours can be explained in this way, so again choosing defecation in shared latrines as a prime example. Of course, as human beings, you and I live in a world dominated by sights and sounds, but our leopard geckos rely much more on vomerolfaction, gustation or taste, and olfaction or their sense of smell. And so how they communicate with each other, we are probably just only on the brink of understanding. This study by Cooper and Steele, for example, showed that leopard geckos were able to discriminate between the scents of male and female conspecifics, with male geckos reacting aggressively towards other male scents and having a different specific set of behaviours towards female scents. Similarly, females had a different repertoire of behaviours in encountering male scents than female scents, illustrating just how these animals may be sharing information in a way which is invisible to you and I. So by this point in the video, I hope that you understand now that leopard geckos are not solitary creatures by nature, and that keeping them in solitude therefore prevents them from expressing a wide array of various behaviours. But of course, we do have to take a step back and think about the fact that all natural behaviours are not necessarily something that we want to promote in captivity. So, for example, we don't want our leopard geckos to perform tail autotomy because although this is natural, it is just a sign of very high stress. So whether cohabitation is something that we want to do or not really boils down to the question of what is positive behaviour that we want our animals to perform. Now, actually pinning down what is positive behaviour in an animal is really quite a difficult business. But to simplify matters, I would argue that anything which allows an animal to behave in a way which it would in the wild without also having a high risk of causing it stress or injury is something that we want to replicate in captivity. Therefore, which behaviour we want to promote in captivity comes down to a cost-benefit analysis of that behaviour. So as a couple of examples, I would suggest that you want to give your leopard geckos climbing opportunities because they would climb short distances in the wild, and although there is a slim risk of them falling and hurting themselves, the risk of this is sufficiently small in my mind that it does not take away from the natural behaviour that it offers the gecko. Likewise, I would say that loose substrates are worth adding into your enclosures because although there is a slim risk of impaction killing the gecko, this is again sufficiently small that it does not, in my mind, outweigh the benefit of being able to dig. As a third example, I would suggest that leopard geckos should be allowed to hibernate in captivity because although there is a slim risk of them not waking up in the spring, the biological implications of this process are worth that small risk. In each of the three cases just described, you'll see that we have a choice between exposing our animals to some, perhaps very small, level of danger and allowing them to perform what is a natural behaviour. To this end, it's worth me pointing out that the risks we associate with the behaviours, so in these examples, injury from falls, impaction and death during hibernation, can be reduced by offering proper husbandry. What proper husbandry actually means is again one of those funny things to define, but you will see, for example, that a leopard gecko, having had a fecal examination and veterinary treatment if required, will be less likely to die from the blooming of internal parasites during the winter sleep than one which is just left to get on with it. But if we don't know that natural behaviours are actually positive, and we do know that there are very real risks with something, why would we want to have that in captivity in the first place? Surely it would just be better for our animals if we just avoided the risks entirely, right? Well, the simple answer to this is that we know for certain that if we don't expose our animals to any risks at all, such that they cannot perform any natural behaviours, then there becomes basically no point to them living. Cue unnatural behaviours such as pacing up and down enclosure walls in big cats in zoos, or glass dancing in our captive reptiles. So whether we are going to cohab our leopard geckos or not boils down to the question of what natural behaviours does it allow them to exhibit and what are the risks associated with group living. With regards to keeping male leopard geckos together, the drawbacks of this are immediate and obvious, so this is not something that I would recommend doing. But mixed sex groups and all female groups are still on the cards if we take the action to minimise the risks associated. Jumping back to Kahn's paper for a second, we see that he states that almost all geckos at a resting place come out as soon as the sun sets and are scattered to forage individually around, returning to the site one by one just before dawn. From this we can infer that leopard geckos aren't cramped together at all times, and so if we are going to keep them together in captivity, then we're only going to want to do so in enclosures which are large enough that they can get away from each other, and in enclosures where we have done all that we can to maximise the space which the leopard geckos can access within it. You will recall from a video I did at the start of 2020 that this is why I originally built the cork background into my leopard gecko's enclosure. The vivarium that I've got for my leopard geckos is a little bit smaller than 3 by 2 by 2 feet, and I really would not want to go any smaller while still keeping a group of leopard geckos together. What would be really good is if you were to have an enclosure sufficiently large to accommodate multiple basking spots while still maintaining a good heat and light gradient, as then the geckos wouldn't need to go near each other unless they specifically aimed to. Another thing you can do to allow the leopard geckos to get away from each other is simply to have a large number of hides in the enclosure, and ideally to have hides of a varying range of sizes. Because male leopard geckos are physically larger than females, they don't feel comfortable in hides quite as small as those in which females will still feel comfortable. So if you've got hides which are just the right size, the females will enter them but the males won't, giving them a place where they can literally just get away. Again, this is something that I have incorporated into my enclosure. And if you are cohabiting in a mixed sex group, then another thing that you can do is simply to have a number of females so that the attentions of the male are spread out between them. Which of course is why I got 2 female leopard geckos and not just 1. And even when you have taken all measures like this to reduce the risks of problems occurring with cohabbing, then if you have a spare setup available to separate the animals if required, then can a case really be made for cohabbing not being beneficial? So much is this the case that I think as we continue to advance our care of leopard geckos, we might come to see cohabbing as a necessary basic requirement of their husbandry. And for this topic, I'm going to hand over to Liam from Reptiles and Research to discuss it further.
So, we know that social experiences and having the means to communicate with conspecifics is an essential part of any organism's behaviour. Some truly solitary species may limit this to breeding and courtship, but others may rely upon social interactions more so, and we know housing such species in solitude is not beneficial. So, it's about assessing how social a species really is. And much like Joe has already mentioned, leopard geckos have been repeatedly cited in the literature as forming and living in loose social groups in the wild, often sharing the same burrows or tunnel networks. A colony of females will be governed and protected by a single breeding male. So if this is their social structure in the wild, and they have multiple natural behaviours specific to social interactions, then a very strong argument can be made for a well thought out cohabitation in captivity. If we take the Animal Welfare Act's 5 animal needs, which includes the animal's need to be able to express normal behaviour patterns, well then, arguably, a solitary leopard gecko is having a whole area of its behavioural repertoire denied to it. And you could argue that housing a leopard gecko in solitude fails this requirement of the Animal Welfare Act. Then there's the needs to be housed with, or apart from, other animals. Now, based on current scientific literature, the leopard gecko is far more social than we previously realised in the hobby. Therefore, keeping a leopard gecko in solitude arguably fails this. The study, Social Experience Affects Territorial and Reproductive Behaviours in Male Leopard Geckos, details how social experiences have lasting effects on behaviour and physiology, including androgens like testosterone, that the physiological development of a vertebrate relies upon. We know that androgens affect bone, muscle development and metabolism in vertebrates. So if keeping a leopard gecko in solitude may negatively affect the natural physiology of an animal, are we okay with that? Most of us would probably argue no. And this isn't even considering the mental stimulation and natural form of social enrichment that may be denied to them.
Thanks for that, Liam. Drawing a line under the rationale behind why I wanted to keep my leopard geckos in a group, I'm now going to move on to the actual introduction of the leopard geckos to each other and discussing how they have gotten on with each other since then. So the two female leopard geckos, Dottie and Pepper, which I bought on the 14th of February, were kept together in the same quarantine enclosure until the 8th of August when I moved them in with Speckles. In that entire time, the only piece of negative interaction which I witnessed was during one feeding session, Pepper accidentally bit Dottie because she was getting a little bit overexcited about the food. But this bit of interaction literally only lasted a second or two and didn't leave a mark. Quite conversely, Dottie and Pepper would always lick each other in greeting, and I even witnessed them learning from each other, which is something that I made a video about at the time. So as I say, it was the 8th of August 2020 that I moved the females into the main vivarium with me male leopard gecko Speckles. So as you can tell from these clips, Speckles, the male leopard gecko, was really quite interested in the females at first. And understandably so, given that at this point in time, he hadn't seen a member of his own species for 3 years and 5 months. More than anything, Speckles just seemed to want to mate with the females, although they weren't particularly receptive to his advances. Now, aside from this though, there didn't seem to be any hard feelings in that initial introduction, and there certainly wasn't any aggression, so really it couldn't have gone much better than it did. Since I first put them together, the three geckos have gotten on really well. Speckles and Dottie, the lighter coloured female, do have the occasional scuffle over food, and it is obvious that in all situations, Speckles is the boss of the group, presumably just because of the size difference between him and the girls. Still, for the majority of the time, the geckos just seem to be content in each other's presence, as is evidenced by the fact that they will happily sleep together right out in the open. To summarise briefly the points made in this video, it is my view that social interaction had ought to be recognised as having positive influences on the lives of leopard geckos, and that therefore keeping them in groups should most certainly not be the taboo that it is currently. To play devil's advocate, I must stress that cohabbing properly will take some knowledge and experience, so if you've just got your first leopard gecko and have it in your head that you want another, well, maybe give it a couple of years before you think about putting them together. So this is definitely not the last time that you're going to hear me talking about cohabitation, because in a year or two's time it will be very interesting just to revisit this topic with the leopard geckos to see how they are getting on with each other and whether my predictions of them getting along just fine will hold out. I'm fairly optimistic. And I also want to make a video at some point talking about cohabitation in reptiles generally, looking at the other species which I have kept in groups, like my lion-day geckos, the Chinese leopard snakes which I tried out, and my western green lizards, as well as some of the stuff that I'll be getting in the new year. But for today, that is the end of the video, so for now, I've been JTB Reptiles teaching you how to follow nature's example, and I will see us all in the next upload. Bye guys!